everyone. Thank you for coming to the Worldview webinar series on preparing your GIS addressing data for the next generation 911 standards. I'm Jennifer Ellsworth. I'm the GIS Data Manager at Worldview, and we are working on a number of PSAP remediation projects and have a lot of tips and tricks and things to share.
My name is Parker Bradshaw, and I'm a GIS analyst for Worldview. I am currently the tech lead for any PSAP-related projects.
All right, we'll get started with you guys. Okay, so on the agenda for this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about what is NG911, give you a little overview. And then Parker's going to get into GIS data needs and some error handling techniques and tips. And then we'll kind of jump into a little bit of the PSAP grant overview in case you don't have that information already. And then just some tips and takeaways for NG911. So what is NG911? Today, it's referred to as E911. Most 911 systems originally were built using analog technologies. Enhanced 911 has been around for 40 plus years, but it has allowed for mobile call handling. So that was kind of an improvement over the years. And calls are routed to public safety answering points, or PSAPs, based on the Master Street Address Guide database. So the MSAG database is how calls actually get routed to the PSAPs. And then the system utilizes automatic location information, so that's your ALI, to dispatch the services. It's intended to be faster and more reliable than verbal communication. So the ALI provides the location to the dispatchers so they can then send their responders. So this older architecture, I've kind of put in a simplified workflow, but basically calls come through the public switch telephone network. So that's the PSTN. It sends information to a dedicated tandem office that uses selective routing technology. And basically that'll query that MSAG, match the originating telephone number to the emergency service number, so your ESN of your PSAP. And then it runs a second query using that telephone number against that ALI database, and that displays the caller information to the telecommunicator. So location determination depends entirely upon the ALI, and that data set is maintained by your local exchange carrier or your telephone company. And the ALI also feeds the MSAG. So all of this database management is handled by the local exchange carriers, but often it's actually subcontracted to a third party. So there's a lot of folks that kind of come into play to make all that data in sync with one another. As far as if you're calling from a mobile device or a hardwired call, different processes happen in between. The mobile location will insert a temporary record into that ALI database to route to the PSAP, but in general, it's all kind of handled through the same methodology. So the current 911 systems were never really intended to receive calls and data this way. They found the workaround for the mobile calling, but now there's a lot of other technology that can't be utilized here. So there's a significant overhaul underway. The public safety answering points need to be upgraded, and the new digital or internet protocol IP 911 system is next generation 911. So when you hear NG911, that is going to be this new system. So in a nutshell, the network elements of NG911 and the PSAP read a location object packet, and that provides the call routing and treatment. And the benefit to this is it's no longer a local kind of integration. It's state, national, even internationally, all brought together so that PSAPs can talk to one another. There's also increased bandwidth capabilities and capacities. This helps reduce costs, and it always helps to be able to send over more complex data like video feeds or real-time text. And they've even looked into virtual PSAPs and poison control centers, other things like that to incorporate into the location information. Incoming 911 calls through NG911 are now going to come through EZNet. So if you hear EZNet, that's the Emergency Service IP Network. So that's that new IP protocol. So the ESInet will allow for voice like it comes over today, but then also all of that other available data. And that'll determine which PSAP will receive the call. NG911 is now going to rely heavily on GIS data for routing the calls. GIS data has always been incorporated through tactical mapping. Telecommunicators will have the map within their computer-aided dispatch. But now the GIS spatial data is going to be critical to processing the calls. We're talking near perfect, near real-time data necessary at all times. Calls can also be seamlessly transferred to other PSAPs. So uniform boundaries between PSAPs, localities and all of their neighbors, the state of Virginia and all their neighboring states. And then standards will be published by NENA. That's the National Emergency Number Association. NENA is where you're really going to be looking for the majority of the guidelines, while VISION will be kind of maintaining this program. And NENA defines a uniform format for data to be provided. So that's your address data, road center lines, other GIS data sets. And we include a little table on the bottom right here where you can see kind of an example where they're giving you what attributes should be in your data. Are they required? Should they be alphanumeric? And a data description that kind of describes why they're in there and how to use them. So you can always refer back to NENA's website for their standards. We included the web link there. And as far as the GIS data being incorporated into NG911, it'll now be necessary before a call actually even can make it to the PSAP. When the call is made, it has to be validated through the GIS, then routed. The system's going to query either the civic location if it's a hardwire line or the geodetic location from a wireless or voice over IP and intersect that with PSAP GIS polygons. So that'll be the very first step in routing the call.
All right, so I'm going to go over the GIS data needs for the NG911 data set. And so first of all, there are critical data layers that will be needed. Your road center lines, your addresses, and your PSAP boundary, your emergency service zones boundaries, and your city or county boundary. So your road center lines, those will be most vital for having a routable street network. It'll provide things such as your address ranges or what direction the streets flow, if it's a one-way or not. Your addresses will provide the physical address point of contact for the phone call. And then your boundaries, your emergency service zones are a geographical area that represents a unique combination of emergency service agencies. It'll be your law enforcement, your fire, and your emergency medical services, all within your 911 governing authority's jurisdiction. So there are two major themes coming out of NG911. Number one would be that PSAPs need to be able to talk to one another. They're currently building the new infrastructure, as we mentioned earlier, with the ESInet, so that there's routing functionality. That'll allow calls to easily transfer data between PSAPs seamlessly. That's currently being worked on, and number two is GIS 911 data needs to be accurate and standardized. While the infrastructure is being built, it's up to you to ensure that this GIS 911 data is standardized and as accurate as possible. Many earlier adapters of NG911 have found that their GIS data is lacking in quality or accuracy, but GIS will be replacing the existing 911 call routing geodatabases. So as transition to spatially based call routing begins, the main question is, do you trust your GIS data to make this move? So one requirement will be that all your source data will be synchronized between your MSAG, Master Street Address Guide, your alley and ANI data, the automatic location number identification, and then your GIS data, roads, addresses, or boundaries. Having these data sets in agreement is crucial to providing telecommunicators with what they need in order to locate and respond to an emergency response call with the quickest speed possible. And next in line will be problem areas to identify. There could be a lot of inconsistencies throughout your data, inconsistent naming conventions, inaccurate or incomplete information, discrepancies between data included in each data set, or geocoding and mapping errors. and analysis of current data will help identify potential issues. VGen is currently providing report cards of local GIS data results. However, a more thorough investigation and collaborative effort is sometimes needed to determine the root source of disagreement between the data sets. For example, some roads may not be in the MSAG data because they don't have any address structures, while other times RCL address range updates may have never been made it back to the MSAG provider for them to put into their systems. So it could go, either from the GIS data side or from the MSAG database itself. So now we're going to move on to error handling, how you can handle an error when it occurs in your system. All right, so we have standardization inconsistencies. As you can see in the little chart there, there's differences between road or avenue not spelled all the way out, or avenue has a period at the end of its abbreviation. So standards facilitate local to nationwide exchanging of data. It provides comforts when asking a neighboring locality for data that it will fit and integrate into your GIS data set seamlessly. So we have some tips for limiting inconsistencies in your data. Look to NINA and VGen RCL standards, which we had mentioned earlier, for migrating current data into the new required data set. Set up a geodatabase domain for expected values, such as road type, then validate your data on a regular basis. So rather than having some instances where you spell out road, and then some instances where you put RD at the end of the road type, if you set up a domain, it would limit it to one or the other, and that way, throughout all your data set, it's always going to be the same format. Lastly, we'd like to summarize your road names, other text attributions, and review for misspellings or other erroneous data entries. So if you take a summary of each road name that's in your network, you can easily see if Smith Road is misspelled with two I's or the M and the I mixed up. So taking that summarization is an easy way to kind of go through your data and make sure there's no very basic errors that just kind of slip past your review process. And so inaccurate and duplicate road ranges. We want to make sure that each address fits within the RCL range and try to stick to actual or potential ranges and not both. That's pretty important there. So look at your aerial imagery for driveway entry points to determine which road the structure uses, which road it comes from. In order to limit data errors and achieve maximum accuracy, it is strongly suggested to some field verification for odd or even address parity and indeterminate entry points. Sometimes you just have to go out in the field and confirm so that your data is as accurate as it possibly can be. So overlaps and gaps with your PSAP or your ESZ boundaries or your administrative boundaries. When it comes to creating and maintaining polygonal boundaries, such as PSAP or emergency service zones, it's imperative that no overlaps or gaps exist. Working with your neighboring locality can ensure both your and your neighbor's PSAPs fully cover the ground and waterways of the area to handle wired or wireless calls from any location. It's been recommended to collapse your ESZs, your emergency response zones, into a simplified network as possible. But you want to develop these boundaries by taking into account your nearest stations as well as their drive times, your historical records and incident reports, and availability of accessible responders. Additional considerations is your road directionality. So rather than digitizing strictly from south to north or west to east, center lines should be drawn in the direction of increasing addresses, with your beginnings of the center line starting at the lowest address of the road. A good way to ensure this is by using the arrow symbology to review, where you place an arrow over the last vertex of the line you've digitized. Road segments split at intersections. So if RCL intersections, the CAD system will not recognize that first responders can actually turn down that road. Be careful when you're planarizing lines for overpasses. You may want to maintain such information in your data attribution tables and update road ranges for any split lines. So the recommended workflow would be to consolidate your data, standardize your data, compare for missing, analyze for accuracy. So from our experience, you can avoid duplicative efforts in data cleanup by following a simplified workflow that involves consolidating all of your data sources first and migrating the current data you have to a standard format. Take the time to work through your individual GIS addressing data sets to correct mistakes and cross-check that all records meet the required standards. You can utilize Data Reviewer and topology. When you're comparing for missing entries, it's imperative that you check your GIS remediation efforts when you get to a stopping point by comparing these data sets with your ALI, your ANI data, and your MSAG data to find where the discrepancies exist. And then when you're analyzing for accuracy, a more thorough analysis and coordination with additional addressing authorities can help with remaining issues. An additional field verification could be warranted at this stage to ensure you get the highest possible accuracy for your data set.
Now, we did have one question come in. Do road ranges have to be sequential? So, for example, if the even side is 100 to 120, the odd side is 101 to 137. So there can be some difference there, and that really comes into when you have actual address ranges versus potential. So if you decide you're going to maintain actuals, there is a good chance that you could have a bigger difference even than that on the even and odd side. And that's okay as long as you work that into your workflow. So if you know that you're maintaining actuals, anytime you're putting in a new address, make sure, as part of your workflow, you say, okay, now I need to update the actual range for this side of the street. It is important that it's even on one side and odd on the other. So you're going to run into issues where that's not the case. You're going to see an address that doesn't fit in. For some localities, maybe there's just a couple. For others, we've found that there's many. And in that case, you want to do some field verification probably to make sure that that's accurate and it wasn't just incorrectly entered into the data set. And if that is the case, reaching out to those folks and seeing if they're willing to do an address update. And I'm pretty sure they would be willing to do it if they realized that it could put them in a bad situation come time for a 911 response call. Thank you for the question.
And so for potential setbacks during your data remediation, policies lacking around address creation, for example, not anticipating future buildings in your address ranges along the road, where very snug along that address range and 5 years down the line, you add a new building, for example, and it can't fit in that possible road range you provided. Citizens carrying addresses to new locations. While citizens may prefer this method, placing a call from an address that doesn't fit in with the surrounding houses or lots can create a major strain on emergency response efforts. So obviously, as convenient as that may be, at the end of the day, if it's saving lives, it's best to not allow that practice. No data maintenance schedule. Routine maintenance, which depending on the size of the locality can range from weekly updates to quarterly updates, will ensure that your data is as up-to-date and error-free as possible. The longer you go without routinely checking in on your data and updating it and making sure there's minimal errors, the more data mess you will have on your hands. Little or no quality control efforts. Kind of goes into that last section there where the more often you're checking your data, the more often you're staying on top of it, allowing those things such as those domains we were talking about earlier so that you can't type in certain values. Things like that will add up in the long run to save a lot of time, a lot of hassle for you. So, and then lastly, there's no synchronization efforts between tabular and GIS data sets. So an analysis of current data input and removal workflows will help identify potential issues. You may have to work with GIS staff, 911 personnel, postal and addressing authorities, and local exchange carriers. Now, this can be a large effort on the locality's GIS staff. Getting data synchronized is only half the battle. It must be maintained once it's created.
All right, and we did have one more question come in. How to handle block range changes that are happening mid-block. Do you readdress them or do you leave them alone? So in that case, if you have a road range that's supposed to be, 100 to 99 and you have something that comes in the middle that doesn't fit 100 to 199, you could split the road. So at that point, you just separate it into dual segments, readdress the segment that makes the most sense. But if the address itself is just out of line, it doesn't really fit into the pattern, even if you break that road segment and create the segment that fits in, when it comes to actually routing to that address, if it's not increasing from the previous segment or vice versa, it's going to throw off emergency responders. So in that case, I would definitely consider readdressing. But I think it just depends on the case. And I know a lot of folks will say, oh, well, this might be a popular destination and our fire personnel or whomever are very familiar with that, so maybe we won't make that move at this time. And that's completely up to you, but do consider the fact that people fill in, you know, you have folks there that maybe don't know the area as well, so I would highly recommend readdressing. All right, I hope I answered both of those questions. And if any more data questions come up, we're going to be talking about the PSAP grant program for a minute here, but feel free to chime in at any time. Thank you, Parker, for some of that information about the GIS data errors. I know he mentioned a few times about synchronization between the GIS data, the MSAG, and the ALI, and I just want to note, you will hear that the MSAG and the ALI, the goal is to have those go away, since everything is going to be centered directly through GIS now, but that could be many years down the road. So it's definitely very important that as soon as you can, yesterday rather than today, have all of those data sets in line with one another so you don't run into any issues. Okay, so the PSAP grant program. This program was administered by the Virginia 911 Services Board. And the PSAP grant program assists with equipment and services to support enhancement of E911. There's also the PEP grants, the education grants as well. I didn't mention those. The VEGN statewide program began implementation in 2015, and the guidelines and the funding change year to year based on the program stage. So we've moved pretty far along. Fiscal year 2020 has migrated. Last year was more of a focus on call handling equipment, full GIS data preparations, and some of the EZNet transition. But at 2020, we've moved to the multi-year deployment. So now there's a full plan in place that VEGN has provided for a 36-month period to have everyone transferred over to the new NG911 infrastructure. And at that point, the GIS data may cut over, or it may be in the process of cutting over. So there are high costs to maintaining the PSAPs and funding NG911 adoption, and unfortunately at this stage, they're focusing more on the infrastructure. So folks that may have applied for a grant in previous years for GIS data preparation, that grant money has been vastly reduced on the GIS side, at least for this 36-month deployment period. But to help PSAP determine eligibility for GIS funding, the ISP staff has started completing the NG911 deployment assessments. So those are the report cards, and they've been called different things kind of over the years. But the report cards that have come out now for all the PSAPs are based on the GIS, the MSAG, and the ALI analyses. And you're going to get all the information you need from their analysis of those data sets, kind of synchronized and joining to one another. That does not necessarily mean they're willing to fund everything there that they've given you, but it's more of an assistance to kind of help you get your GIS where you think it needs to be. So as I mentioned, funding for this deployment period will focus on only specific items identified in a migration proposal, or MP, to maintain kind of the schedule and the budget to make sure that they stay on top of the deployment period. The transition is planned to occur one E911 network or selected router pair at a time, as I mentioned, for a 36-month period. And their plan is to start with the most populous networks first. So this is a little table that's been supplied recently on the kind of plan to start with Fairfax and then to move through some of these different selective router pairs. And this map is available on VEDA's Integrated Services site under the 911 Services NG911 Deployment Program. So they may update that over time. I would definitely check that out and keep that in mind. So for the GIS data requirements, only a subset of the discrepancies that will be funded will basically be those that focus on data errors that will cause the call routing function to fail. So anything that will actually not route at all. Other issues that come up in your data, just as the question came earlier about the addressing issue, it'll work and it'll start to route the call, but it may route it to the wrong place, and it may add minutes onto the response time. So those are still definitely legitimate issues, definitely things you need to fix. But for now, what's going to be funded during this deployment period is just those errors that will cause it to fail. And your ISP coordinator can definitely work with you to identify those errors. We know what those errors are. It's a number of line items in your migration proposal, but you'll also be reviewing those with your ISP coordinator. So definitely work with them and any GIS specialist to ensure data meets the 98%. So if you're not already aware, 98% of location records will need to be retrievable in your GIS data for you to successfully cut over. So any kind of funds that you're looking for, I would definitely recommend submit to ISP as soon as possible, as soon as that information is available, and they'll try to incorporate that into your migration proposal, and you will review that. The PSAP and the ISP and anyone involved in that process will review that together. All right, so that's a little bit about the PSAP program. You may have already received your report card and your migration proposal, but depending on that deployment schedule, you may have some time, even up to 1 to 2 years before that will be reviewed. So you have some time to get your GIS data up to date. So for some final takeaways, upon NG911 deployment, the MSAG and ALI tabular data will go away. So some training will likely be needed for future maintenance of the GIS. It's good to get your data ready and set up, but maintenance is very important. You want to make sure you know how to maintain the new data and the new schema. And NENA has released the new schema format for NG911. It's not required at this time that you adopt that format, but as they kind of work out the new EZUNet structure and how Virginia is going to take in all of the data, some of your current data will end up migrating that way down the road, most likely. So look at the standards now, think about getting your current data in the standards now. And as a second note, until NG911 deployment, both the MSAG and ALI are still the backbone to your 911 call routing. So synchronizing these data sets is critical. And it can be reliably accomplished by qualified trained individuals. So any GIS, managers, specialists, folks like that have the appropriate training, you definitely want to get with them, come up with a maintenance procedure. We've actually found in some cases, folks will look at specific items that are wrong in their data, try to fix those, but it'll actually cause more discrepancies with these other data sets, the MSAG, the ALI. So really we suggest just look at them all at once, take it as one big effort so that you know you're not going to run into an issue down the road. So with all that said, some final tips for everyone. Update your internal workflows and processes. Do that as soon as possible. This will help improve the speed of your updates, improve communication across entities. Some folks, at this time may not be working directly with their 911 center and their emergency responders. Definitely get together, get with those folks, and make sure that you have a good plan in place. Also coordinate with addressing authorities. Keep that data up to date. Make sure there's no duplications, no omissions. Those are definitely the most critical issues. Also think about upgrading your ordinances for such processes, such as addressing assignment. You want to make sure that, planning makes it into GIS, and maybe if a building is demolished, that address point actually makes it out of the GIS. So make sure your kind of ordinances are in place so that those processes can happen seamlessly and easily, and the right folks are involved to make sure that it does happen. And finally, stay connected to the NG 911 transition process. Vision has offered a lot of outreach and educational opportunities. They have a webinar series as well to keep you in the loop on where progress is with the state. So check those out. It's critical your GIS data be ready. So the Vision assessments will verify your data meets those minimum standards, that your data won't fail in the system. That's definitely what's most important at this time. But you also want to make sure that additional data issues can't lead to some fatal mistakes down the road in an emergency response situation. So consider GIS best practices, consider all the things we've tried to mention today, and make the necessary corrections to get your 911 system performing at its highest level. So that's kind of what we have to share with you today. Our emails are below if you want to reach out with any specific questions. All right, well, we thank you for your time, and again, feel free to reach out, and have a great day. Thank you.